Well, I'm going to tell you my 5 reasons why you need to leave the West now and move to Moscow. My name is Jim. I'm from Scotland and currently I live here in Moscow. I've been living here for about 1 year. I think I'll be in Russia as long as Russia lets me be here. This is indeed the very last video I'll ever do from Moscow.
Привет! So it is the summer of 2026 and I just played you there some clips from a British guy who went to Moscow and made this content back in 2024, imploring you, the Westerner, to follow him and move to the Russian Federation. It's been something that I've observed here on YouTube in increasing numbers since the 2022 Russian invasion of Ukraine, that you have this kind of content on YouTube. And in today's video, I'm going to assess how his advice from 2024 stands up in summer 2026. I'm here on a scorching July, late July's afternoon in Odesa, Mama, on the shores of the Black Sea. Clearly not in Russia, but in free Ukraine. And let me know down in the comments what you think are the motivations for this Scottish guy and the others who come from France, Germany, the US, Canada, etc., who make this kind of content, claiming that everybody should move from the West to the Russian Federation. Surely they can't all be paid Kremlin propagandists like Alexander Yost is alleged to be. Are they doing it for ideology, for money, for fame, for vanity? Let me know what you think down in the comments. So let's go and look and analyze his advice from 2024 and what he said now that he is departing the Russian Federation in 2026. Adimo.
New Europe Experience.
Welcome to another episode of the Vodka Vodcast with me, Conor Klein. This is the New Europe Experience, and in today's reaction video, I'm going to be looking at some content from Moscow, definitely not in New Europe. It is the heart of what I refer to as Eastern Europe nowadays. So we're going to be seeing what this Scottish guy claimed back in 2024 when he was imploring fellow Westerners to up sticks and relocate to Moscow, the capital of the Russian Federation, clearly in full knowledge of the geopolitical situation, so the diplomatic relations between the Russian Federation and the countries from the United Kingdom, but broadly speaking, the West was pretty terrible, very hostile, and it's with the backdrop of the Russo-Ukrainian War, which is the biggest war in Europe since World War II, that started back in 2014 and then dramatically escalated in 2022 with Russia's expanded invasion of Ukraine, completely illegal, and has led to, at a minimum, hundreds of thousands of people being killed and trillions probably at this point in damage. So he's encouraging you, if you're from the West, at least he was back in 2024 before he went back in his decision, in spite of having appeared, as I showed in the intro, having said that he was basically in Russia for the long haul on what seemed to be Russian TV. He's gone back in that, so we're going to look first at what he actually claimed in 2024 and see how that stacks up, and then we'll look at what he said most recently to explain his decision to return to Brexit Britain, I guess, so at least temporarily.
Okay, let's start with number 1. Safety. Believe it or not, everything you're getting told by the Western media about Russia, about how safe it is, about how it's scary, it's dark, it's unfriendly.
Well, geopolitically, it's definitely unfriendly with the West in general, if one used that term.
Well, from my experience, and remember, all I'm doing is giving you my honest experience. I'm not trying to make anything up. I'm not being paid by any government sources that some people have suggested in the comments. All I'm doing is telling you the honest truth. This is, by far, the safest city I've ever been in. Why is it one of the safest?
Well, we'd have to know where he's been if he thinks Moscow is the safest city that he's ever been to. So let's see.
Is it one of the safest cities? Well, you've got to look at a few factors. I would think, first of all, is that Russia's zero tolerance on drugs. That takes away a lot of the petty crime. Because it's, in my opinion, in places like my country, Scotland, with drugs such as heroin being rampant, creates a lot of addicts, creates a lot of people that need a lot of money, and they need their money fast. And when people need money fast, what are they going to do? They're probably going to steal things, they're probably going to rob things from people, they might even...
Okay, he's focused in on one issue. It actually reminds me of the film Trainspotting, since he's talking about drug-related crime. That might be a big issue where he's from, somewhere in Scotland, maybe it's Glasgow, and that is one element of crime. Now remember, he's imploring Westerners to actually move to Moscow, not just come on a trip and check it out as a tourist, where definitely petty crime is going to be one of the biggest issues if you go somewhere as a tourist, because you get targeted, you're seen more as a soft target by thieves. So I guess he's referring to like maybe pickpockets or other types of small petty crime like stealing phones and stuff like that. Something that's definitely an issue in many Western European capitals. They also have a lot of tourists. In Western Europe, you don't have the same level of tourism in Moscow either, even though it's a huge city and it does attract a lot of international tourism. It's not going to be on the same level. So he's honed in on one specific type of crime.
They might even mug people and take things like phones, bikes, etc. Now, what I've experienced in the 8 months that I've lived here is that I've never seen anything being stolen, even though mostly bikes and scooters and things are not chained up. They're left on the street without any problems. That's the ones that are put out by different companies and people's personal items. I've also noticed zero violent crime. Now, I'm not saying it...
So this so far is just purely anecdotal. He hasn't noticed what he seems to live maybe in one particular area in Moscow that might be a lot safer than the others. And it might just be his lifestyle that leads to him not being exposed so far to petty crime.
I'm not saying it doesn't exist, but what I'm saying is when you're on public transport or you're walking home late at night on especially like a Friday or a Saturday night, where in the UK you would see things ranging from people verbally abusing other people, usually down to alcohol, fights, or even assaults, which I've witnessed on a regular basis. If you walk around any big city or town in the UK, I guarantee on a Friday or a Saturday night you're going to see some form of violence or verbal abuse towards others.
Okay, so he's describing something that I personally have seen a lot in the United Kingdom, which is that when the pubs close, there's a little bit of violence on the streets. And he's saying that he has not seen that in Moscow. Well, the whole idea that there aren't lots of Russians drinking and getting in fights is a little bit unbelievable, but okay, it's his experience in a specific area of Moscow. And he hasn't seen that particular issue, which seems to be something that probably afflicted him a bit where he was living, presumably in a big city in Scotland. So yeah, we'd have to look at really what are the stats on crime. Now, Moscow itself tends to have a little less petty crime than many major Western European cities. However, things like the homicide rate are like multiples of the cities in Western Europe, and if you're actually moving and living in Moscow, you're also going to have to deal with the insane corruption, which is another form of crime. So it just depends on what kind of crime you're talking about. He said safety, so I guess he means a violent crime, but not homicide, which is the most terminal type of violent crime that there is. So it's pretty selective, no stats, just his personal experience living for a short amount of time in his particular area of Moscow. So not a very compelling argument overall. And actually, when you look at it in terms of just Europe in general, then cities in Central Europe and in the parts of East Europe that I promote, my new Europe, the crime is even lower than it's going to be in Moscow itself. So it's very selective in terms of what he's pulled out here. And he hasn't discussed things like terrorism, also an issue in the Russian Federation in Moscow. We had, I think it was after this was filmed, the terrorist attack where I think it was over 100 people were shot dead in this Crocus attack by some Tajiks from Central Asia. So similar kind of terrorism risk, it seems, based on that you'd see in a lot of Western European cities. That's also something to be aware of. And that's not even to get into, obviously, the whole issue as it's transpired with safety in Moscow since then, especially in the last year or so, as the Ukrainian drone capabilities have improved and now they can obviously hit places in like Moscow, which wasn't the case when he originally filmed this. So I'd say overall I've been to Moscow. It is not, my perception wasn't that it's super dangerous, okay, to be there, but it's again very selective that he has picked on just one type of crime. And I think if you look at just outside of Western Europe, then there are a lot of places that have similar lower crime, and conveniently he just completely ignored homicide rates or any sort of statistical evidence. So I would say that that's selective, not entirely incorrect. Let's see what he says next.
Number 2 is the cost of living. Compared to any other major city, especially capital city, I'd imagine, throughout Europe, the cost of living here is so low, so affordable, but yet the standard of service, the standard of cleanliness, the standard of safety is so much higher. I can't get my head around it. You know, I understand people say in the comments that Russian salaries, etc. are low.
Well, that's the whole point. He's obviously referring to compared to the United Kingdom, where the salaries are going to be way higher than the salaries are going to be in Russia overall. And again, he's only talking about Moscow. We can't even talk about if it's safe or not in many provincial Russian cities. Like he is just talking about Moscow. And this is going to be presumably the most expensive part, basically, of Russia, where he's talking about seems to be central Moscow. And again, it's like, where are you comparing it to? Are you comparing it to London and then maybe the center of London? And what are the salaries there? Because if you were planning to move, then you're going to need a way to finance your lifestyle. And if you are going to be dependent on local salaries, then if they're going to be just commensurately smaller, then and maybe even commensurately smaller again, you may end up actually with lower purchasing power. And that's not even to talk about the fact that you're going to need to get a work visa, and that's not so easy in the Russian Federation if you're coming from the United Kingdom. And the other alternative is that you are relying on some sort of remote income. Either you're working online or you have some passive income that you're able to receive in the Russian Federation. And therein lies the problem, because with the sanctions and incompatibility of foreign credit cards in the Russian Federation currently, it can be very tricky to actually get your money, even if it's passive income, to you if you're in the Russian Federation. Now, if you are able to receive it, obviously you're getting it in British pounds in his case, if it's from abroad, or it's US dollars, or it's in euros, then yes, your money will go further as long as you're able to actually get it in and use it, and as long as the exchange rate remains favorable. Because I remember going to Moscow, it would have been back in 2012, and with the exchange rate back then, Moscow was even more expensive than being in London and Paris. I remember going out to dinner with some girls from Paris who were studying there, and yeah, the prices even for them were shocking at a nice restaurant in Moscow. So these things can also flip. So if you're planning to move, there's a lot involved. It's not like you're just popping over for the weekend. So you'd also have to factor that in, that maybe the exchange rate even changes and then your money doesn't go that far. And you've obviously invested a lot if you've gone and moved to Moscow, like he is encouraging Westerners to do. So let's see what else he says about the prices.
But I can only look from my point of view. From what I'm paid very well, and the cost of living is very low. For example, my essential...
So he must have some very specific job in Moscow. That means that the salary is quite attractive, outside of the fact that the cost of living is at the moment lower in Moscow. So that's going to be a very, very unusual situation. You may have a niche skill that's going to allow you to be paid more than you are in Western Europe in the Russian Federation, but I'm not really sure what that is exactly. It seems he was doing English teaching at a very specific place, because in general, even English teaching, I can't imagine it would be that much more getting paid in Moscow nowadays than would be somewhere else. But okay, maybe there's a few people with a specific situation, but in general, you're going to be paid dramatically less. And okay, this is filmed in 2024. before the inflation really started to get out of control in Russia, so maybe there was still some benefit back then. But you need to be aware of the fact that in general, you're going to be paid dramatically lower in the Russian Federation than you are in Western Europe.
My essentials come to about $1,000 per month, which would be my rent, my transport, my food, etc. Now I can't remember exactly what I covered, but if I link it up here in the box, you'll see my full video, my full breakdown on the cost of living.
For sure, in the further east you can go in Europe, in general, the cost of living gets lower and lower. If you're just looking at purely in the foreign currency terms, you're looking at how far your dollar goes, your pound goes, your euro goes, and that is a trend that we see. The difference has been, probably since this video has been made, that now with these wars and the cost of energy going up, that we've seen inflation in many places, so the gap has narrowed quite a bit, and especially with respect to the Russian Federation and Moscow. So yeah, I would say overall, definitely cost of living, if you are able to get your foreign revenues into the Russian Federation, that's a big if, because you probably lose a good bit of money on exchanging and having to find some sort of circuitous way to get your money into Russia at the moment with all the sanctions and the problems with bank cards. But if you do manage to do it, then yeah, euro with the current exchange rate is probably going to go further, allow you to borrow more, at least when he was making this back in 2024.
Now we're going to look at number 3, and that ties in with what I've just been speaking about, and that is services. Now, I could do a full thing on the transport, but here, I think I've spoke about it in previous videos, so I won't go into great detail. You get a thing called a Troika card, which lets you get on the bus, the tram, the MSH, which is the big circle. What else? Bus, tram, MSH, oh, metro, of course, the metro. And then you have the things like the bikes, the scooters, which are of course an extra cost, but they're plentiful. They're all over the city. You can get one, you just open it with the app, you go where you need to go, you leave it where you want to leave it, and they all work, they're all safe, and no one messes with them. I think I'm going to cut in a little montage of some of the travel options. Let's go.
Okay, the whole thing about services was basically the metro. Okay, so I guess he likes the metro. I have to think, I was on the metro in Moscow. I took mainly taxis to go places, but they have a big metro system that seems pretty extensive. He showed some parts that look pretty fine in it. Is it better than public transport in, well, maybe in the UK it is, Brexit Britain, but in Western Europe, maybe he's just talking about the center again of Moscow. It seems a pretty weak reason is just to talk about the metro being okay. So yeah, services in general, when I was in Moscow and in St. Petersburg, now I should say I was in Moscow in 2012 and then I was in St. Petersburg in 2019, and I had previously been there, but it was a long time ago. It was probably about 20 years ago. I was also in Kaliningrad, so that's probably not very relevant, the part that was 20 years ago. In those cities, they do have modern metro systems. Are they better than the ones in the rest of Europe? I wouldn't necessarily say so, but it is very big, that's true. And apparently, at least for the amount of money he makes, he finds it cost effective. But that's not really a reason to move somewhere, I would say personally.
Okay, now moving on to number 4 of the 5 reasons that you should leave the West now and move to Moscow. Number 4 is the cleanliness. This is the cleanest city I've ever experienced.
Really? I don't know where this guy has exactly traveled to. Moscow in general, Russia clean in general? Not really convinced by that, especially having been there. I remember when they have the season that the snow melts and everything, just like with all the slush, the stuff that's been hidden under the snow gets released. But okay, it doesn't look particularly littered where he is. Is it better than some parts of Western Europe? I'm sure it is. Is it, yeah, in general better than a European standard, especially if we look at Central Europe, which in general is pretty clean in the big cities from my experience, then yeah, I'm a bit skeptical. There's a reason to move there, remember.
Everything is immaculate. Now again, I'm talking about in the...
Everything is immaculate?
Again, I'm talking about in the city. I know people say, oh, you go outside of Moscow and it's not the same. I'm talking about Moscow, I'm talking about the centre.
So he's just talking about the city centre of Moscow. So I guess maybe in the city centre of London it's not as clean. I definitely would say that in many Western European cities, the city centres should be cleaner than they are. But if we look at Europe in general, especially Central Europe, yeah, it's as clean as this. I don't see why we would be moving from the UK to Moscow.
The places round about the Bolshoi Theatre, I'm talking about Shabalovskaya, where I live. It is the cleanest city. Now it's quite hard for me to show you just how clean the city is, but what I can do is I can tell you that they have these trucks that go around. I think it's daily, I see them every day, and they spray the street, the road, and then another truck comes behind it and washes the street. They also have smaller versions of these. There's tractors pulling a trailer and they go down the footpaths and the pavements or sidewalks if you're American, and they spray and they clean. So everything comes up amazingly, sparklingly clean. So I'm just going to show you a little bit of where I am right now, and then I might cut in some of those trucks if I can find any. Let's go. Okay, for the last one I've came to sit on the steps of the beautiful Bolshoi Theatre and enjoy the sun.
Yeah, that's not very compelling. You can live in lots of parts of Western Europe. In your neighborhood it could be clean. Yeah, the city centers, as I said, some cities leave a bit to be desired, but as a compelling reason to move to Moscow, yeah, not really doing it for me.
Number 5, the 5th reason why you should leave the West now and move to Moscow is the traditional culture and family values. What do I mean by that? Well, when I look at the culture in my country with the leftist politics, and I look at what's happening in America, how it's been sort of ripped apart, when you come here, traditional values of the family, of femininity, masculinity, are really upheld and celebrated and not demeaned like they seem to be in the West at the moment. In the West, everyone seems to be a little bit confused by who they're meant to be, what they're meant to be, how they're meant to act. Here, everyone really goes by specific, defined roles in society, and everyone seems to be quite happy with that.
Now, the Russian government talks a lot about traditional family values, and that's in the rhetoric. However, in reality, on most metrics, Moscow in particular is not a traditional family values place. Divorce is high, birth rates are low, sex outside of marriage is pretty normal. What else do we think is, women do go to work there. People are not particularly religious in Russia, even if the government is trying to push the Orthodox religion more and more. Outside of the significant Muslim minority, which do have bigger families, presumably probably less promiscuous, although I can't really say that 100%, they have definitely more traditional mindset. They're definitely a lot more religious, and they are a growing part of the population in Russia. Because of their high birth rates. But in general, yeah, there's a big discrepancy between the state rhetoric and the reality on the ground. So yeah, I don't really buy this traditional values thing, unless he means like they go traditionally and invade their neighbors and try and steal their stuff. Then definitely Russia is traditional in that sense. But outside of state rhetoric, there's a huge mismatch between that and what it's actually like. And I actually got, surprisingly, some consulting calls from guys who even went to Moscow looking for these traditional values in the women, and then called me complaining that the women are modern in Moscow and not traditional. And yeah, so I think it's very inaccurate to describe Russia in reality as being traditional family values, even if the state is trying to promote it a lot.
Tennis player, a swimmer, something like that, In Russia, you don't need to worry about her getting to about 18 and then some guy who's maybe not winning any medals in the guys event, he suddenly wants to become a girl, and then if he's a swimmer he dives in that pool and breaks all the records, like I see is happening in America. In Russia, that sort of nonsense would not be tolerated. In Scotland, my country, a recent case that I was reading about was, you know, I won't go into too many details, but in Scotland it seems to be that you can.
Yeah, he seems to be just focusing on transgender issues, which I guess might have been more of a news item back when he made this video. It is true that in Russia now, for sure, because laws have become more repressive since he made this video in general, and we'll get into that about what has changed since he made this video in a little while. Definitely there is less freedom to be openly gay. I know transgender and gay are separate topics, but they kind of get bundled in together, especially in this whole traditional values discussion. And yeah, it is harder to be openly gay in Moscow than it's going to be in, say, Paris or London. The whole transgender thing, I really don't know much about it, to be frank. I don't think it's a reason to move. But again, this is what he's telling you to move for, because apparently, yeah, they are even more strict on things like transgender.
It seems to be that you can commit a crime as a man, even a violent crime against a woman, and then suddenly tell the courts that you're a woman, and then when you're sentenced, you go to a women's prison. Again, it's not something that I would agree with, it's not something that I think is right, but I'm not telling anyone else how to live, but that's one of the reasons that I love it here. Common sense seems to prevail, traditional values prevail.
Common sense and Russia, really? Common sense? There are many things that I can accuse Russia of being, but common sense, having common sense is not one of them. And this war definitely demonstrates that, this train wreck of an invasion they launched. But for him, it's common sense to be in Moscow.
Prevail, and family values are still upheld.
All right, they're not upheld. They're maybe more promoted in state rhetoric. I think that's the conclusion. But just look at the stats for what I think are the main metrics for traditional family values. You would see a nuclear family with low divorce, high fertility rate, probably little to no sex before marriage, and what else? I mean, what else is traditional? Is traditional values outside of that? Maybe women's role in society, that they're not allowed to work or something. I'm not really sure, because he only talked about, it seemed transgender was the only thing he thinks is worth mentioning with traditional values. But on most of the metrics, if we look at it, then you'll see that Moscow, Russia doesn't have really traditional values in reality. I would actually say that's kind of the same everywhere in the region, and it's a misnomer that has always been a bugbear of mine when people say that. Again, the big exception is the sizable Muslim minority in Russia and in Moscow, because there are a lot in Moscow. Yeah, they tend to have the bigger families, lower divorce, and yeah, probably stick to definitely be a lot more religious and actually, you know, go to their place of worship, the mosque. But outside of that, no, it's not in reality going to be much traditional family values. You just have to look at the leader. He's already a divorced man himself, with a lot of alleged affairs, but apparently as long as he goes on the podium and starts wailing about traditional family values, then that's all fine and dandy for the Russian propaganda machine. Again, maybe that appeals to you, but it wouldn't be a very compelling reason, having been to Russia and having been to Moscow, to actually move there. And I definitely wouldn't describe him as having much common sense in general. So to summarize, his 5 reasons to up sticks, move, relocate to Moscow back in 2024 were: number 1, lower petty crime, although it doesn't seem like the crime is actually that much lower, especially if you were to move there. Number 2, cost of living. Okay, the issue there is, well, what are you going to do for work? You're going to have to get a visa. You're probably also going to have to speak Russian for most jobs. And if you rely on a foreign, remote revenue stream, then you're actually going to have a lot of problems getting your money into the country. But yes, definitely if you could get your money in, then the cost of living is in dollar and euro terms going to be significantly lower in Moscow than a comparable city, if there even is a comparable city because Moscow is so big, but obviously compared to living in, say, London or Paris or New York, for example. Number 3 was they have a nice metro, okay? It looked fine in the photos, the little clips he showed. Number 4 was, it's clean, but he's only really talking about the center of Moscow is clean. Again, is that enough of a reason to actually move? And then number 5, he talks about traditional values, but he only really talks about transgenders in women's sports and something to do with a prison in Scotland. So again, these are extremely weak reasons to actually go through all the hassle of relocating yourself, making a decision that's probably going to have lifelong repercussions. And that's what he gives as an argument. Let's see what went wrong. Not entirely unexpected that he's decided to leave Moscow for good in spite of his initial claims. Let's see what he said on basically the way out in one of his videos here.
All right, guys, number 1, the first thing that I'm not going to miss living in Russia is the extra airport security checks. As a British passport holder at the moment and throughout the whole time that I lived in Moscow, every time I flew in to the airport, apart from one time I got straight through. I couldn't believe it. It was like Christmas Day. I actually said to the woman, like, seriously, are you letting me through?
So I think it's important to point out here that on his channel, now he has, it seems, purged a lot of his videos, which is pretty common with these kind of content creators when they want to suddenly go either back to the West, the wicked West, obviously speaking sarcastically, or they're a Russian YouTuber who's been, promoting Russia, but then they still want to go on their holidays, a bit like Ellie from Russia, who I reacted to a few years ago. She's apparently also made her videos unavailable, then suddenly showed up in France doing her travel vlogging as if nothing has happened. So there's nothing on his channel highlighting any of these issues until he was safely out of the country. And that is kind of the elephant in the room about moving to Moscow. You are going to a repressive authoritarian state where it's illegal to, well, just formally illegal to criticize the military or anything to do with the war. And there's a whole list of offenses that you can be automatically deported if you violate them. And basically, you're not really in a great position to say anything negative about the Russian Federation while you're living there, especially if you're on YouTube, which is a public platform. Maybe it'd be fine if you have a small channel, but once it get big and it comes to people's attention, probably going to get in trouble if you start to say anything unflattering about it. On my many live streams, my Sunday show that I stream regularly, I have quipped over the years that this kind of YouTuber that you should be very wary of in terms of their content, that they are too scared in Russia to even criticize the crappy winter weather for fear that they will get in trouble. Like, they can't even criticize the weather in case it gets them in trouble. So this will be interesting to see what exactly he is willing to criticize once he's safely out of the country, and why he never disclosed any of it to you while he was actually filming in Russia and encouraging people to move. Very, shall we say, untransparent as a way. So here he has pointed out that the whole time he was there, he was getting interrogated at the airport for being a British citizen, for the obvious reason that Russia is extremely hostile to the United Kingdom. And we have this war here unleashed upon Ukraine by the Russian state, in which Ukraine is being backed in part by the United Kingdom. So we are on different sides of, we could say, a new Iron Curtain. It's not quite an Iron Curtain yet. It is possible to travel like it was originally just after World War II between the South, East and West. It was also possible for a time, but you will be subjected to more checks, and you may spend a lot of time at the airport, and you may, a lot worse may happen to you being a British citizen. Have an incident where people had to be exchanged back after they were put in prison for a few years, quite conveniently by the Russian government, because then they could use you as a bargaining chip to get one of their assassins or just some spy or something back by, if you happen to have broken a law and who knows, in Russia, it's not a country known for very effective rule of law in general. So he never brought any of this up while he was living in Russia, but now that he is outside, he's starting to tell you that was basically a huge pain in the backside every time you tried to cross the border and come back into the Russian Federation. The other thing is, of course, there are no direct flights between his country, United Kingdom, and the Russian Federation, so you're going to obviously spend more money and time transiting to get there. So yeah, extra passport checks is apparently something that he says he won't miss, and maybe part of the reason that he has decided to not stay in Russia. Let's go and look at the next one.
Let's go on to number two. Number two of things that I don't think I'm going to miss is the length of the winter. Now, the winter in Moscow at Christmas time is beautiful. There probably isn't another country that I've experienced that do it so well. They really embrace it with the ice skating and the winter markets and the lights and Red Square all lit up, etc. But when you've got to live it and the weather starts to turn around October, starts to rain, starts to get grey and cold, and then the weather doesn't really start to get good again.
Okay, so now that he's safely out of the country, he's free to tell you that something that should have been pretty obvious about being in Moscow in the winter. The weather sucks. It is grey, it is cold. And that is something that afflicts most of the region, including the countries that I promote here on the channel. So yeah, the winter in, say, Latvia, Estonia, also cold, also gray. Same in Poland and Warsaw. It was the same when I used to film in Belarus back in the day. Same in Kyiv. It's a little bit better down here in Odesa because we get more sunshine in general during the winter. Same in Chisinau. But this is something that should be blindingly obvious. And the fact that he never discussed this when he was actually in Russia tells you what the nature of the Russian state is, or that, you know, he just doesn't want to ever talk about anything remotely negative. He was trying to get you to move. So that is something that is a telltale sign of someone who is not being completely forthright with you. If they were promoting moving to a country and they are never saying even the slightest thing that is negative about the country, that is not credible. There is no utopia anywhere. Of course, there are things that are negatives and you need to figure out which is the best fit for you. So this is probably a major thing to discuss. I mean, hey, for over 6 months a year, it's going to suck weather-wise. And if you are the kind of person who is like a migratory bird who wants to go all the time where the weather is warm, then you probably shouldn't move to Moscow. That's for sure. Because outside of the summertime, it's going to be pretty miserable for you. So I think that's self-explanatory. I think most people realize that it sucks. And the fact that he was more or less playing it up as a great place with this winter wonderland while he was there just shows why you need to be very skeptical of these kind of YouTubers, in particular when they live in authoritarian states. If someone never says anything bad, that's the kind of rule of thumb. Don't believe them in general.
Your landlord just registers you online. It's dead easy. Let me try and put it in more context for you from a foreigner's point of view. When you want to live in an apartment.
So here he's talking about something that's quite esoteric to Russia, is the registration. And in particular, it actually has big ramifications in terms of being a foreigner, being able to rent an apartment in Russia. That sounds like a bit of a nightmare. It seems to have been for him. He did he did some videos showing off his apartment. You know, this is the kind of stuff that he should have been bringing up to have been disclosed for people that he was encouraging to move without talking about it. So it sounds like a huge problem. I haven't seen that anywhere else that I've experienced in the region. Obviously, if you're going short term, you can use Airbnb. Well, you can't use Airbnb in Russia because it no longer exists, but fine. At least when I went to Russia, you could use Airbnb. And in this general region, there are going to be some idiosyncrasies with respect to renting more long term, but I've never heard of this been such a big issue in the countries that I spend my time in. But that's good to know that apparently in Moscow, another reason not to move there is just the bureaucratic nightmare that it creates in terms of being able to rent an apartment, in particular as a foreigner. So let's go on to the next reason that he says that he won't miss.
All right, number 4 of things I won't miss. Well, this one's kind of selfish because I was thinking about them and I'm saying, right, what difficulties did I have living, because I want to make this video, and I'm going to go with the language. And that is completely down to me, because I can speak some Russian. Например, раньше я жил в Москве, я изучал русский язык 2 года.
He seems to speak a pretty basic level of Russian. It's not like he's ununderstandable. However, he's saying this is something you won't miss. You won't miss having to speak in a foreign language. Well, then, probably should have considered that before you emigrated to a country that doesn't speak English, or where English is not going to be that widely spoken. And Russian will take a long time to learn if you don't speak another Slavic language already, like a similar language, a similar-ish language. And having learned many languages myself, most Americans in particular just have taken high school Spanish. I would say that having learned Spanish and having learned Russian, Russian takes 3 times longer. So just picture how much more time you're going to have to invest in order to speak good Russian, that you're actually going to be able to get the full return on your investment. And yeah, he didn't point that out as when he's telling guys just to move to Moscow back in 2024. It's going to take several years to get to a reasonable level of Russian. You're actually going to be able to do things every day. And maybe in the center of Moscow, if you're hanging out in, well, I was going to say more touristic places, but I'm not sure how touristic they are nowadays with English-speaking people. Yes, there will be some people who will be able to speak to you in enough English to sell you stuff, but in general, it's going to be very tough, and you're going to be exposed very quickly for being an English-speaking foreigner, and that can have severe consequences for your safety, in particular with this war in Ukraine, where a lot of the Russian media is telling the Russian people that it's all the wicked West that is arming these Ukrainians to defy us in taking over the country. So this is something that he should have been more transparent about as well. Russian is going to be a hard language to learn, and you're going to basically need to learn it in order to flourish here, having moved. And it seems that he wasn't so motivated basically at the end of the day. So, okay, let's go to the 5th reason that he says that he will miss, because I think this is a lot more interesting. The last one.
Right, the last one, and is one that you might not understand how frustrating it is until you deal with it, is the internet problems, the internet restrictions. Now, I don't know which country's restricting which, but all I know is some countries restrict traffic from Russia, and Russia restricts other websites, other things from, or companies from doing business. And when I first arrived, it was fine. The internet was fast. You had a few things, I think, maybe like Instagram and stuff, which I don't use that much anyway, didn't work, I think. But then, really over the last year, the restrictions have become greater and greater. Things like WhatsApp and Telegram, which I would always use to phone people back home, stopped working. And of course, YouTube stopped working.
The irony of this, as a YouTuber, he's living in a country promoting to move there where you don't have proper access to YouTube. Never mind Telegram, Instagram, WhatsApp. Basically, the Russian government tries to force people living there, not just its own citizens, to use its own app, which obviously they can eavesdrop on and read all your messages and come and see you in the middle of the night, because it is a repressive authoritarian regime. And he never brought up any of these inconveniences while he was actually in Russia and telling people to move there. Promote a move to the country, not telling you that, hey, your Instagram's not going to work, your internet's not going to work. So there's 2 parts to this. One is the Russian government trying to clamp down on people's ability to communicate without being eavesdropped on, so they don't want you to use the normal applications that you've been using, or get basic information from outside the country, potentially, that might be disfavorable to the Putin government. The other part of it is that they have started to restrict the internet in general as you go around. So there are parts of Russia, maybe not parts of, well, there were even complaints in central Moscow that a lot of times the internet wasn't working at all on your phone, and you had to wait until you were on Wi-Fi in order to use it. Just think about how inconvenient that is going to be for you. Now, that is a direct consequence of their war against Ukraine, because well, this is what the Russian government says, the reason for turning it off, their mobile internet, is so that Ukrainian drones that fly into Russia to hit what are in general legitimate military targets in Russia may use the 4G or whatever, 5G, whatever we're using, the mobile phone network in order to navigate, also your GPS. So the Russian government just basically turns those off. That means your quality of life is already back about 10, 15 years in the center of a city like Moscow. It's absolutely mad. And in fact, he never talked about this. It says a lot about this kind of content. And I even saw another British YouTuber in Russia actually taking a swipe at guys like this indirectly by calling them out, saying they're just painting this image of everything being perfect in Russia when there are a lot of things that actually suck. And even on his channel, he walked around showing you that the internet wasn't working as he was going around for a day in a part of Russia that looked pretty crappy, to be frank. So that is what it tells you about these kind of content creators, why you need to be wary of them. Is anyone trying to sell you basically the Brooklyn Bridge that someplace is a utopia. And it also says a lot about the nature of the Russian regime at the moment, that, yeah, he could get in trouble if he had told you that. That's the reality. And now he chose to move to Russia. He must have known that what it was going to be like. And then he decided to be a Brit walking around with his camera promoting move to Russia during these times. And he is not doing you a very good service if you were the person listening to him with intentions to move there, because he didn't give very compelling reasons. Okay, maybe traditional values one appeals to some people, even though there he only really talked about transgender issues, and he didn't discuss or disclose what it's really like in terms of the restrictions, never talked about the government and what that actually means if you go and live in Russia. As a Brit who just speaks Russian, I could see him talking after 2 years, but doesn't speak great Russian, is going to stick out like a sore thumb in many parts of Russia at a time when there is all this hostility. So let me discuss next, having sat through his 5 very poor reasons to move to Moscow in 2024. Now you see a little bit what he wasn't telling you about what was really like the entire time he was there. So that shows you that his channel wasn't very transparent. Now let's get to the big parts that he didn't explain, which you would need to know if you were going to consider moving to Moscow in 2024 or 2026. Now, there's obviously the big moral point. You're moving to a hostile country to yours that has unleashed the biggest war in Europe since World War II, has killed hundreds of thousands of people and committed tens of thousands of war crimes. So that is something that apparently, let's be frank about, if you're still considering to move to Moscow after knowing all that, then that says something about your moral compass. So that's probably going to already, most people are not planning to move to Moscow on those grounds alone because of the geopolitical situation. And now we live in times where you can't just ignore the geopolitical situation and pretend you're going to be okay, because if you move to the Russian Federation, to Moscow, with say a British passport and an American passport, that can have very severe consequences for you, both in the Russian Federation and also if you decide to move home, because you will have already moved to a country that was hostile, which is going to raise a lot of suspicions unless you have a pretty compelling reason to be there. Maybe you have a personal reason to be there, maybe you have a work reason to be there. But if you're moving there on a what they'd like to call the shared values visa, which is basically a defector visa, you're basically saying you hate America, you hate the United Kingdom, you hate France so much that you moved to the Russian Federation with the war going on because you basically agreed with that society, then that marks you out for more surveillance when you come home, and quite rightly, because basically you made that big statement. Now, you may have moved to the Russian Federation on a different visa, but then you've got to consider what are the consequences to living in Moscow with this war going on. You may be subjected to verbal harassment, physical harassment, because you're going to have soldiers coming back from the front who are going to be pretty traumatized, and you are, in their eyes, potentially an enemy. And, you know, no, he doesn't discuss it, and they all seem to glaze over, but as this war goes on longer and longer, and it goes worse and worse for the Russian Federation, and more people are traumatized by it, and more people have friends and family that are at the front potentially killed, potentially coming back as invalids, and they're media is telling them that it's your country's fault, then you're putting yourself in danger from just some sort of vigilante behavior by some Russian. There are lots of people who are going to get drunk in Russia, who are going to be violent in spite of what he tried to tell you at the beginning about in Moscow. And then you've got the Russian government to worry about that at a certain point. Might be in their interest to exchange you, i.e. detain you for some reason, and then swap you for one of their people that they want to get back in this kind of new Cold War situation that we have going on between, we'll say, the collective West, although with Donald Trump in power, hard to really talk about a very united collective West, but nonetheless, and the Russian Federation and its allies like North Korea and Iran and kind of China, more or less. So that is something that is a big void in his videos that needs to be explained to people, is actually the reality. Then you have all the legal problems with getting there. You need to get a visa. He talks about, learning Russian is hard. For most jobs and for actual integration into life in any country you move to, you're going to need to invest in learning the language. And that's going to take many, many years. So you're going to have to consider, are you willing to do that if you want to move to a place like Moscow? And I'd say that's basically for anywhere. So you really need to think about the consequences if you're going to move to another country. So you're thinking long term, you have potentially going to look at clearly residency, maybe even becoming a citizen. You also need to consider if you're going to a country that is at war, that has had mobilization back in autumn of 2022, and is looking at having another mobilization probably in the near future. Are you going to be forced to go into the military to come and fight against Ukrainians on Ukrainian soil? Is that something that you have considered? Like, he never talks about it. And it's not just Russian citizens that are eligible now for mobilization. It's actually also permanent residents. And I saw that on one of these channels promoting the move to Russia. It was actually helping people go and fight against Ukrainians and kill them and try and steal their stuff. So it's definitely a legitimate concern. And in an authoritarian state like the Russian Federation, Vladimir Putin can literally wake up in the morning and pass a decree, and you are on your way to the front in the next few weeks. So that might be, he might decide that all those people who signed the shared values, who defected, they're also eligible. Maybe even temporary visa residents could also be eligible. Who knows what the guy might decide to do, because you are not going to be very expendable from the Russian state point of view. You're not even a citizen. So whilst I don't think that Russia is going to want a lot of Americans in its military, probably for national security reasons, they're thinking that these people are going to be easier to justify mobilizing than actual Russian citizens who live, say, in Moscow and St. Petersburg. So you need to think about all these things. Are you going to have children who may end up being Russian citizens, especially if they're male? They would be forced to go to do their military service. They may be in the future forced into the army. It may even happen also to women at some stage, in spite of what Jim there was claiming about family traditional values. Who knows? The Soviet Union itself had a lot of women in the military. So there is that tradition in at least Moscow to also put women in there. You have to think about your property rights. If you are still a foreign citizen, say you're still British, you buy property at the moment, that's fine. If it is not in an area that's designated as a border region, and they may just wake up in the morning and change that definition, then you're going to have to sell your apartment. Or you're going to have to put it, maybe if you're married to a Russian woman, in her name. So there's just a lot of things that are not looking good just from the legal point of view of being a foreigner in Russia, or if you end up having a foreign or a Russian partner, if you decide to move somewhere. And I know a lot of the guys are going to be attracted to going to Russia for the beauty of the women, and I'm definitely not denying that there are a lot of beautiful women in Moscow in particular. The problem is that if you don't speak great Russian, then you're going to be dependent on the girls that speak English, and a lot of them are going to actually want to be with a foreign guy to get the hell out of Dodge and actually get out of Russia. You could be their ticket out, and then you could have another whole world of problems. Trying to get her a visa for the UK, just trying to travel with her, integrating her into British society as a Russian with all this geopolitical tension. Then on top of it, what happens if she gets her British passport after a while? I've seen plenty of Russian women divorce their British husbands or American husbands once they don't need them. So You're just going to have all these problems coming from a legal point of view if you go there. On top of it, what has changed since 2024, which actually, in top of him mentioning the whole issue with the internet and some other bureaucratic stuff, may be a major reason for him to actually want to also get out of Dodge with his tail between his legs and get back to magical, I'm being slightly sarcastic, Brexit Britain. Inflation, you think you have a cost of living crisis in your home country? You better be glad you don't live in the Russian Federation, because they have massive inflation. One of the big things, and it's only going to get worse and worse. Even if you believe the official statistics in Russia, their economy is basically in a lot of trouble for well over a year. They've had this war economy that they've been pivoting to. So basically the war economy is crowding out a huge amount of the domestic production in Russia, which in the short term is helping some people. Probably not going to be you, but helping some people because maybe they go and work in a factory that's building munitions or something similar to do with the war. But in general, their economy is basically producing all this stuff that doesn't have a return on investment, like a tank that just goes to Ukraine, gets blown up by a drone. They don't take much. They've already looted what they were going to loot in Ukraine. Their army isn't making much progress. And as a result, their economy is in a world of trouble. And they can massage the numbers any way they want, but they are basically in dire straits. Taxes are going up. So if you're paying Russian taxes, they're going to go up, presumably. That's what you would be doing. Okay, maybe not, but presumably you would be paying your Russian taxes. You probably wouldn't want to not pay your Russian taxes because you're probably going to end up in a Russian prison for sure if you keep doing that. And they have had massive inflation over the last few years. What he's talking about, the cost of living, everything's so cheap. Not looking so cheap anymore, and it's only getting worse because now Ukraine is targeting Russia's energy production. And that has led to some parts of Russia having real problems getting fuel. And that gets, not just is that going to be an inconvenience if you're trying to drive somewhere and you're going to have to pay to fill up your tank, it is going to impact on the entire economy. You probably noticed with the war going on in the Middle East that it also led to a small spike in the oil price, and that led to just everything being more expensive back home. If you have it like it is in Russia at the moment, then everything starts to become more and more expensive. Food, you go to the restaurant, people, just anything that involves transport, which is going to be most things that you're going to have to pay for, it leads to them becoming more and more expensive. And if we say that the exchange rate seems more or less the same, and so even if you're getting paid, you're getting your money from outside, everything is going to become more and more and more expensive. So that is something that has changed in 2024. Definitely the cost of living is becoming less and less attractive in Russia, and you may end up this winter, depending on what happens, with not having heating in your home. Other things may fail. We just have to see what happens. But that is another crisis looming for Russia as Ukraine develops the capability to strike deeper and deeper into Russia. They're going to plan to do, I presume, what Russia has been doing here. So believe me, it's not going to feel like a winter wonderland and super cozy if you haven't showered for 3 days and your apartment is minus 20 and the water is all frozen over because the government wasn't able to sustain the energy system. And maybe Jim has gotten some common sense finally, as he loves to quote about Russia, and decided this is the moment that he doesn't want to endure having already lived there without proper internet or being able to access apps and actually even YouTube itself. So that is something that is likely to happen this winter. Of course, we'll have to see. But since 2024, things have gotten progressively worse and worse in Moscow, in Russia. Most of the country is a dump, to be frank, because it's so big, it's so poor, it's so badly run. Corruption is rampant. Money gets stolen. The infrastructure overall is terrible. There just are islands of prosperity like in central Moscow or in St. Petersburg and a few other places where, relatively speaking, the quality of life has been pretty good. But with this war that they've unleashed, they're now feeling the consequences, and it's only going to get worse and worse. So you got to look also at Russia's long-term prospects. If you're planning to move there, it ain't looking good. It ain't looking good at all, especially if you see what happened when they lost the Afghan war. Soviet-Afghan war, what happened? Well, eventually the country started to crumble and there was like desperate poverty. So is that a place that you really want to move to, defect to in effect, even if it seems that Jim here has been able to come home having defected and get back to this side of the new Iron Curtain or Icy Curtain that is being formed. And improving Russia without a military defeat in this war, historically, doesn't happen basically. Normally it's military defeats that lead to some sort of reform within the Moscow system. So that's probably what it's going to take in order for things to change in Russia. And as a foreigner, to stake your future on a place like that seems to me absolutely mental. But then again, people like Jim think it's just common sense. So I'm not here to try and save those that love the idea of Putin and invading Ukraine and killing a large number of Europeans and think that that's all fine to go and, like Jim did, even promote the country at that time as a Brit. However, on this channel, I give you the candid and informed opinion about the countries that I spend time in, and a lot of the things he mentioned as reasons to move apply even more convincingly to countries like Poland. If you move to Warsaw, cost of living is going to be more advantageous there than being in New York or a comparable city in the United Kingdom. It is better value for money. It's not going to be pennies on the pound or cents on the dollars, but you really get better value for money in this region in general, and it's on an upward trajectory economically. So if you do invest in real estate, you do set up a business, you do basically bet your future on a country like Poland, then that is clearly going to be a wiser decision, in my opinion, than betting your future on a move to Moscow in 2026, or it was obvious to me in 2024. I help my clients with moving to those countries. I give you lots of inside information and tips about how to move there and live a life, especially if you are a high-level man. In particular, if you're a single guy, it's an amazing region to move to in general. You're just going to have so many great options in your personal life and also, I think, in your professional life as well, and looking at your quality of life, most importantly, going forward. And also legally, it will have less ramifications for you if you move to Poland as a Brit. Obviously, if you're an EU citizen, you just move there the next day without having to get a visa or anything. But it won't carry the same scrutiny going forward as someone who's been moving to Russia and then trying to cross international borders from then on may lead to you being questioned, not just at Moscow airport and been held back for several hours. You might find yourself also been held up in other airports across the world and been someone of interest to several governments. And it's just a lot easier to do. I help my clients also with getting visas if that is necessary. We can go into a plan for you. So in conclusion, I'll say that this Scottish guy, Jim, he encouraged Westerners to move to Moscow in 2024, walked around his camera showing you a very rose-tinted perspective on what life is really going to be like for you if you go there. I've outlined this kind of content where they never say anything bad, even about the weather, until they're safely out of the country. Not credible, not someone you should be listening to. And you should be more skeptical of the hype that you see around certain countries in general. And you should also be questioning, hey, what kind of government am I going to live under? What are they going to do in terms of surveillance, restricting my rights? What kind of human rights am I going to have if I go to a country like Russia in 2024 or 2026 and make a more sensible decision about where your future may live? Because in the part of Europe that I promote, not only is it better in terms of what he cited, cleanliness, cost of living, safety, what else did he say? Services. I think actually the bureaucracy is actually a bit lighter in this part of Europe as well. Also, taxes tend to be a bit margin. They're not tax havens here, but they are a little bit more advantageous. And I think we could say on his fifth point about the traditional family values, I think that's a misnomer, but you don't have as much of the extreme wokeness. So here, I think we can safely say that you don't have the extremes that you would see in, say, what's known as woke culture, that part of it in, say, United Kingdom or the US or other parts of the collective West. But at the same time, it is actually more common sense if you come to countries like Poland, New Europe, Baltics like Latvia, Lithuania, Estonia, Romania. You don't have that. And at the same time, you still have things like proper rule of law, more or less, and human rights, things that you should be pretty grateful for if you want to log on to YouTube and use things like Telegram and WhatsApp on a daily basis while fear that the government's either going to cut you off, throw you in prison, or just, disconnect it completely and leave you in something resembling North Korea in terms of communication. So that's what I will say about Jim, the Scottish guy in Moscow. I know he's going to rename his channel now because Scottish guy in Glasgow doesn't quite have the same unique selling point to it on YouTube as Scottish guy in Moscow. Maybe he's going to suddenly decide to move on and go to Tehran or Pyongyang and tell us how amazing those cities are and why you need to move to North Korea in 2026 and escape the wicked West. So it's another beautiful, scorching Sunday afternoon here at the height of summer in Odesa, Mama, on the shores of the Black Sea. And behind me, you can see the iconic Odesa Opera House. Now, if you are an intrepid traveler who's planning to come to Ukraine, then an indispensable companion of yours is going to be my insider's guide to coming to Ukraine. In there, not only do you get logistical safety and cultural information, you'll also get access to the hospitality section where I will impart to you my favorite cafes, restaurants, bars, clubs, and shisha lounges here, not just in Odesa, Mama, on the shores of the Black Sea, but also in the capital, Kyiv, in lovely Lviv, in the west of Ukraine, and two other cities, Uzhhorod and Chernivtsi, which are in the west. Pretty much also Chernivtsi, you can say, is in the west of Ukraine. Now that is for purchase down below via the link in the description to this video. And on top of that, I have recently been feeding all my guides into, so that is not just the one for Ukraine, but also for neighboring Moldova, for wonderful Warsaw, for classic Kazakhstan, over on the Central Asian steppes, and for the New Europe, Baltics, Latvia, Lithuania, and Estonia. I have put those guides into what my clients are dubbing Conor AI. And not only there do you get access via the subscription or bundled in with one of my consulting calls, access 24/7 to Conor AI and these guides. The Conor AI is trained on my video content here on YouTube and my premium content that is off the channel. So you can literally tap into my encyclopedic knowledge 24/7 for all your questions about business relocation, relationships, networking here in the cities that I cover on this channel. So you can go and check it out. Down below, you got the Insider's Guide to coming to Ukraine during the war, and you got the Conor AI. And you should probably also go and just check out the consulting page, because the best way to use the AI is post-call follow-up with the Conor AI. So go and check it out down below. And I wish you a very pleasant afternoon, morning, or evening whenever you're watching this on from Odesa, Mama, and of course, Slava Ukraini. Do peremоги.